Kia ora koutou, nau mai hoki mai. Welcome back to Branching Out, the podcast where we discuss Indigenous forestry and Aotearoa. Today we're back with Heidi Dungey and jumping straight back into our discussion about breeding. Tēnā koe Heidi, welcome back. First question for you. In what ways does molecular biology intersect with tree breeding, and how has it changed in the field? And, maybe how has it changed in the field recently?
So molecular biology is just helping us become more accurate, really. The Radiata Pine Breeding Company, we've been working with them, and more recently they've been working with other organisations to integrate this into the Radiata Pine breeding program. And all they're doing is genomic selection, which is being done in animals and plants all over the horticulture and agriculture sector. But it's not common for it to be in forestry. What we're doing is using markers to correlate with the traits, and then using the trait patterns to predict those traits in other trees, and therefore know more about trees that don't have that information previously, and also to understand to a greater accuracy the relationship among trees, which then makes your breeding values that you predict much more accurate. And so it's all about accuracy and speed, I think. You can even look at how strategies to select at a greater intensity within families and among families using this technology and get greater performance faster. I think that's probably a simple way to explain it. And then I think we're also starting to go down the pipeline of understanding what genes do what, and soon, hopefully, maybe even not need some field testing, which will then say, well, every second generation, maybe we do some field tests. But then ultimately, what we can produce for whoever's growing the trees speeds up basically times twice. Yes, twice as fast. So that's also significant. I think the forest industry is quite conservative and in adapting some of these technologies, but I think finally we're really getting there, and it's going to make a very big difference in the next few years. And in terms of other species, well, we have tested the technology in some eucalypts, and it's shown to really improve our ability to manage inbreeding. Any species you can get inbreeding depression.
Are there any specific genetic traits that you look for in tree species to enhance their resilience or resistance to pests and diseases?
Healthy trees. You always look at all the traits that you can do, and while you're breeding for growth and form and diameter, if you don't have a healthy tree, it's not really going to grow in the forest. So you always monitor your disease and your pests and anything else that's going on. You just have to really be very observant and, I guess, agile. So if something happens that's unexpected, you need to figure out how you can put it into the pipeline fast. And I know that a generation of tree breeding takes a long time, but remember we have seed orchards already that we could just rogue. And roguing just means you could remove some of the trees that are more diseased, and that therefore that removes that disease susceptibility for the seed that goes in the forest, even as far as the following year or following second year after that, if it's a pine.
Okay, so from a breeder's perspective, what do you think about eco-sourcing? What do we know about eco-sourcing, and how does that impact the population genetics?
Yeah, so eco-sourcing is based on the principle that what is adapted locally is best locally. And I think ecological principles, that's fine. And particularly over the last couple of 100 years, that's fine. However, with climate change, things are changing faster than perhaps things can adapt. And I'm just wondering if we need to think about it a little bit more deeply, and in particular examine what actual evidence do we have that local is best. I know that in many of our provenance trial results, where we've done collections of exotic trees and put them in one place and then compared the performance based on the environmental variables, actually the local provenance wasn't best. So I think it's a good conversation to have. It's a really important conversation to have, but I'm not sure we've got the evidence to say that that is actually the best approach. I think we need to understand, number one, what is the genetics of the population? Well, we don't know in many cases. Well, in most cases, are they all inbred? Maybe like a Kiwi, maybe they'd actually be better off to be crossed with the guys over the way. And in the absence of any evidence, we've fallen back into this protect and preserve mindset, which is about conserve what's always been. But under climate change, actually, you might be putting that at risk. So going back to that adaptive active management is how do we help our ngāhere cope with climate change? To me, that is the biggest thing that we need to be thinking about for the next 50 years. If we are going to have that change in temperature, that's huge for some of the basic biology of trees and plants and how they grow. Maybe some of these disease outbreaks aren't actually just disease outbreaks, but they're stress from the changes that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years. So how do we help our trees cope with that stress, or our plants cope with that stress? And I think we really haven't thought about that enough. We think about protection and conservation in a way that's it's not going to work anymore. And that's my own personal opinion.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It's the hard thing, eh? You can understand communities wanting to preserve that whakapapa, but, going back to your sentence of people wanting to preserve what's always been, it is so hard to tell what's always been or how long something has been there, What if you're preserving something that's actually just been there for like 40 years and you didn't even know it? And it's actually was invasive to that area, by your own standards 40 years earlier. So it's quite a hard one to track, eh?
And also humans are very good at moving things around. Let's just take seeds, for example, seeds from grasses, just stick to your socks. Karaka, for example, that was taken around the country. There's examples that we probably even don't know of yet that are in narratives that we could actually understand a lot more as a model to say, well, what would it look like if we maybe swapped some of these among ourselves just to help preserve?
Even like a whāngai kind of process, eh?
Yeah, exactly. We'll fungi some of our trees, you fungi some over here, and then maybe if we know they're a bit more resilient anyway, then some of their babies will help the next generation be even more resilient. And I think that's okay. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that could work really well. And if you think about, some of the work we did in Kōrero, I think it was quite interesting. We found that there appeared to be some resilience of the kōrero to some of the dieback in each of the rohe that were tested.
Yeah, I remember seeing those results.
And that to me is so cool because it's not one rohe that's got all the possible kōrero that might make it. Everybody does. Imagine if they just looked at selecting some of those and planting from them, and then maybe fungi across some of the rohe, some of the more resistant ones. And then I think there's more chance to try and make sure there's the next generation of kōrero forests doing it that way.
Collective survival, not just for one rohe, for everybody. It's a big deal. So as I've sort of sat here and watched you for a few years, you've worked with a whole heap of different Indigenous groups and Māori, and it's been really, really cool to see. What role do you see tree breeding playing in supporting Māori aspirations for whenua and ngāhere management, and how does your work align with these goals?
I think that my work aligns very well with the goals because I think, there's multiple possibilities across that paradigm from production right through to conservation, where breeding could simply help out with diversity management, or it could actually, say, some hapu might want to actually breed for production forests. And, a good example is tōtara in Northland grows like a weed. What an absolute possibility to think about something that's actually your taonga, but actually could help feed the hapu as well. And I have no idea what that would look like in a cultural context, but I could certainly see a way of helping to do that as a tree breeder.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the important part, right, is that communities know that they have a resource to tap into if they ever want to understand from more of a science perspective how these things work and how it might integrate or tie into their cultural values.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, in that sense, the biggest learning for me was that, I'm not the leader in this anymore. I'm helping was the first big step that came into my head. It was really powerful. Yeah.
Can you share any examples where you've collaborated with Māori rōpū and the impact that those partnerships have had on Indigenous species in your projects?
Yeah, I think when we talk about breeding an Indigenous species in working directly with hapu, it's been really impactful if we can actually support the hapu to have people directly involved in the project and learning about it. And I think we've been lucky enough to have a Jobs for Nature project where we've been partnered with Rotuiti 15 and employed folks who are directly involved in taking cuttings or seed and looking at how the trees are reacting and assessing these trees to myrtle rust damage and noting that it's been consistent among the different genotypes or the clones or the cuttings that we've taken. And really it's given a lot of hope because we've found that there is a lot of variation in rohutu, for example, and it's shown a pathway for maybe making sure that these plants are going to be there in the Ngāhere for the future. We've been lucky enough to grow additional plants too, so these tonga are actually going to go back to the marae and to the people involved in the project, which I think is a pretty special koha in a way for the project to have done that. But it's been a very involved project and something that science probably never done before. And I think working directly as a team alongside hapu has been so rewarding. Yeah, really, really fantastic. I think we've adapted some of the things we do and vice versa. And it's in those spaces that some of the golds really come. The observations that the team make, and then the scientists talk about it, and then there's something that clicks and say, oh yeah, that might work over here. And yeah, so, and I guess that's always interested me, that type of thing in my science career too, is looking at those spaces between different science areas. So instead, here's a science area and a science approach, which is mātauranga. It's the space in between that's actually quite transformational, I think.
Yeah. And so I guess building off of that, how do you approach building trust and fostering meaningful partnerships with Māori communities in your work as a tree breeder? Because as you said, there's some pretty scary topics in there.
Yeah, I think it's really about just being equal, being part of the group, showing and absolutely demonstrating your dedication to the work and to them, and just being, I guess, operating with intent and integrity. And yeah, I think it's just really important to be a person.
In some ways, it can seem really scary, but it's actually so basic. I guess it depends on who you are and the situation you're walking into. But what have you learned from your experiences working with Māori organisations around integrating mātauranga Māori into the research that you do? Is that quite challenging?
It can be really easy, but it can be really challenging, and it all depends on who and how and what. And I think the important thing is to be open to all those possibilities and not be afraid of some of the more challenging situations. Just work through it. But I think the experience is extremely rewarding on all sides. Really, really good. I would encourage people to go there. You will experience some brick walls and some hard times as a scientist, something that you won't understand. Our training is quite interesting in that context, and I've thought about this a little bit as well, is when you do a PhD, you're pretty much told you're pretty good, So to come into a situation where you have to rehumanize yourself a little bit.
Prove yourself, really.
Yeah. I think it's transformational too for a scientist.
And maybe humbling in some ways, really, eh?
Totally, yeah. And I think that's probably the key word for how to work together, is to be humble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you've worked with Rotuiti 15 and a bunch of other groups over the years that I've seen. So what strategies or approaches do you recommend for enhancing the capability of Māori and other Indigenous peoples in forestry science and research? What pathways do you see there for them?
I think through recent experience is this amazing new applied masters at Toi Ohomai. We've got a student now who's going through that as one of the first masters. And it's going to provide a really amazing pathway for people with experience in life, to obtain a qualification that will open doors in the science realm, right? That's so silly that a ticket like that is what's needed, but that's what you need. But the most important thing is to keep your eye out for a spark and make sure that when they say, I might be interested in maybe working after I finish this internship, that you grab them, because they're the little golden bits that come along once in a lifetime.
Yeah, and I know sort of over the years I've noticed you talking about Indigenous knowledge exchanges as well, and I've definitely seen a lot of benefit in those exchanges.
Yeah, I can't say how lucky I was to get this catalyst exchange from the Royal Society, where we invited 11, I think, Indigenous folks from Australia to visit. And it was aligned with the Rotuiti 15 project, and they got to stay at a marae and also visit the Kura kaupapa. And yeah, it was really emotional. I think basically it's around the connections that they made and the deep understanding that some of the talk about the whenua, like there's this amazing saying of the country needs people and people need country. And it resonated with us so much, and the need to preserve language and how the Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders are really still challenged in finding the resources to enable that. And so they saw what has been achieved here. It was really inspiring for them.
Yeah, it sounds like a really rich experience. Moving over to the future of Indigenous forestry, what trends do you see shaping the future of Indigenous forestry and tree breeding in New Zealand and beyond?
Yeah, I think the ETS, the return of whenua to Māori, it's the economic powerhouse of the Māori economy. I think this will provide New Zealand opportunities that we haven't even thought of, because what I think some of the recent cyclones has shown us is the desire in people to try something different. And Indigenous forestry is an opportunity that may fit into that category. It's something different. It's probably not going to pay a lot of money like radiata, but it will pay something, not just cash, but to the community and to the ecology of the whole island. So I think now is such a great time when all these kind of difficult things causing a little bit of chaos, but out of chaos sometimes comes some pretty cool stuff. So I'm hopeful that we can start something. I do think in this latest government, it's a little bit challenging to see some of the windows of opportunities opening in the next few years, but it doesn't mean we can't start thinking about it and start putting some steps in place to make it happen. Particularly, we're okay probably this year because most of it's going to be El Nino, but what about next year? So I'd like to see us not drop that narrative.
Yeah, for sure. And so how can the forestry industry better support the establishment of Indigenous forests and the use of alternative species in their practice?
I think this is a good question because it's one of the reasons I've probably trying my new opportunity of PF Olsen, because one of the things that they would like to develop is options around alternative species and Indigenous forestry, not just radiata pine. So it's not going to be fast, but it's definitely a future that we see at PF Olsen that we can probably help achieve.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity for you to kind of stretch that a bit further, eh?
That's right, into a bit of theory and lots of talking into hopefully some practice. That's the theory. Or hopefully.
What advice would you give to aspiring tree breeders interested in focusing on Indigenous species?
I would actually say just do a degree in it, get your basic understanding of what tree breeding is under your belt, and then imagine something that you would like to do with someone. Hopefully it's with mana whenua, but just get your basic tree breeding under your belt, even if it's 100% Pākehā style. That's cool. Learn the ropes, then adapt it to what you want to do in life. There are international tree breeding courses, but I would recommend you probably need something like a degree under your belt.
Yeah.
It's a little bit statistically heavy.
maybe learning a bit around science communication might be a good idea for people to be able to communicate these big, scary ideas without them actually coming across as big and scary.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned in the last 25 years of my career is that science isn't everything. Being able to do the mahi behind the report isn't just as important as the communications. If you are able to make a difference, it's often through how you spread your ideas or how you spread opportunities or thoughts. That doesn't matter if actually they get picked up elsewhere, as long as it happens. So I would encourage definitely to those scientists, if you like communicating and if you're good at it and if you're good at relationships, take the jump because it's pretty rewarding. It's really, really cool.
I guess sort of moving into community and environment impact. How do you envision the role of Indigenous forests in addressing climate change and promoting environmental sustainability?
I think Indigenous forests are key to absolutely providing some long-term resilience in some of the challenging sites. It doesn't need to be Indigenous, but actually Indigenous forests are going to be what public want. It's at the heart and the minds of Kiwis, right? And we want more Indigenous forests on our land. So I do think some of those more susceptible slopes and more susceptible soil types are ripe for actually planting in Indigenous forests, and maybe continuous cover forestry or small coop harvesting or something that we don't normally do here, but it's definitely possible, because I guess people think forestry in New Zealand is only what we do now, but forestry is all types of forests, and we just need to adapt to what the new paradigm might be. It's pretty simple to me.
What is your personal sort of view of the difference between a forest and a ngahere? So everybody who I have asked outside of this podcast has given a different answer, and that's the thing, is we don't really have a consensus. So yeah, what's your opinion on that?
A forest is a forest. There are different types of forests, and anything that's got a canopy cover with trees in it, to me, is a forest. Some forests are single species planted in rows, some natural forests. I think there's a nice paper that describes between hard out, almost like farming fibre forests, through to the conservation estate, and then there's all these different types of forests in between. Something that could be like, maybe there's a monoculture native forest. We could probably imagine that if we tried hard enough. But then there's something that's multi-species, single age. Maybe then there's multi-species, multiple ages, and then there's a whole complex conservation type forest. So I think they're all forests. It just depends on your perspective normally on how you define a forest. And often it's forests are only the conservation estate. And that's how all forests should look. But then I think also we all use fibre. We're all going to need to use fibre. We all need to use wood because it's more sustainable in our future. So it's just a farm of wood.
It's a good one, a farm of wood. It's a wood farm.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go head down to the wood farm.
Wood farm. A wood farm.
It's a funny way to put it. Interesting. I like that, wood farm. So can you share any success stories where community involvement has significantly contributed to the establishment or management of Indigenous forests?
There's several examples. The most important example is using science to create the knowledge about the forests that they have in their care to make management decisions for themselves. So, for example, it might be about, in the Cody example, which ones appear to be more resistant to the Phytophthora that's out there. Or it could be which trees are natural in this environment and which trees are introduced. And that can be solved quite easily with science, but without science, the information isn't there to make informed decisions for the mana whenua. For example, in the myrtle rust case, again, we really think about, is there resistance at all? And that says yes or no. Well, okay, there appears to be something, and now they actually can understand, yeah, we can actually do something about this. It's more like providing information to empower the management decisions that the kaitiaki have to take.
It's kind of talking to place-based management, hey, and understanding or trusting people that they know what's in their own backyard and trusting that community science enough to make informed decisions using science on that, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, cool. So, closing thoughts, what message do you want to convey to listeners about the importance of Indigenous forestry and the role of tree breeding in achieving ecological and community goals?
I just think tree breeding could really open a lot of doors for our future and for the future of Māori land and for the future of future generations, actually. You know, we're not going to probably see a lot of benefit in the next 50 years if we plant the trees now, but we actually are giving a gift to the next generation, because then they'll have the choice. Are we going to log some of this, or do we want to just use it in other ways? And just even giving them that choice is pretty cool. So my advice is just to at least have a look at it. Is it actually something that you think is going to provide value to your hapu or your people? My guess is yes, even in maybe doing a genetic study on the variation of what you've got there. Do you need to think about fungi with some of your cousin iwi or something like that? I just think at the moment we're not actually making decisions in an informed way, and science can certainly help figure out what you have, what it's looking like, how healthy it is, and then you decide what you do after that.
All right, most important question. Last one. What is your favourite tree species?
Oh, gee, you know.
In the world.
That's
global. You can choose any of them.
Oh, no, that's too hard. I love them all, but I do actually really like Eucalyptus regnans because it's the tallest angiosperm in the world, tallest flowering tree, that means. And basically it gets up to 120 metres. And if you see it in the wild, it's massive. And that massive trees get me very excited. It's very weird. But yeah, it's so beautiful. I do really like that one, but actually I pretty much like them all.
Yeah, okay. All right. Good to know. Tēnā koe Heidi. Thank you so much for giving us your time. We know that you're a very busy scientist, and we look forward to hearing more from you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into today's episode. Join us next time to talk about Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. Mauri ora.